السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قبل البداية في هذا البانل اللي راح يكون جميل إن شاء الله، راح نشوف معكم فيديو قصير نستأذن المنظمين إنهم يشغلونه. Now it's going to be in English. So, is this the first Oasis of dialogue that Qatar debate has started or do in the past? No, it's not. But I still believe this is going to be the best one because this is the first U.S. edition Oasis of dialogue. This is number one. Number two, is this the first U.S. championship, U.S. Universities Arabic debating championship here in the US? No, it's not, but I still believe that this is going to be the best US Universities Arabic debating championship, inshallah. Before we start this panel, I would like to say, I'm really honored to be part of this panel because those amazing people are doing a lot for something that we all support, and we're doing just applauding for them. So thank you guys so much. If you don't mind, Hanaa, I'll start with Mohammed. Of course. So Mohammed, this morning I was sitting next to one of my friends and I asked him or her, what do you think of Mohammed al-Kurd? This guy is all over the place after Sheikh Jarrah, and he's killing it. What do you think? What's the first thing come to your mind when it comes to mentioning Mohammed al-Kurd? And she said four words actually.
Okay.
First one, he's bold. He's cool.
Thank you.
He's logical. And the fourth one is he's a breath of fresh air. So I would put all these four words in a one description of you, that you have this charisma that we needed. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
As a young Palestinian, how would you describe the difference between your generation's discourse and the traditional political figures' discourse when it comes to القضية الفلسطينية?
Well, first of all, hello everyone. Nice to see you all. Thank you for taking time out of your day. Thank you, Noura, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Muhammad. I think the actual chasm, the dichotomy that has existed so much in the Palestinian narrativizing of our own struggle has not really existed in the sense of how we talk today versus how we talked 10 years ago. I think the real chasm existed in how we talked in English versus how we talked in Arabic. I think for decades Palestinians have articulated our struggle as a struggle against colonialism, as a struggle against police brutality and settler brutality. And we have struggled to articulate this in the media, definitely because of incendiary interpretations of Palestinian speech, as well as smear campaigns and distracting methods of debate that have really hindered our ability to, connect our issue. And this year, I think and when I say we, I mean hundreds of thousands of people that participated in a digital revolution, if I may call it, were bold enough to reclaim the narrative as their own and say this is a struggle against settler colonialism, this is a struggle for human rights, and this is a struggle that has gone on for too long and must not continue going. And I think the most important aspect of this shift in narrative has been that it's been focused. So much of what we have done in the past years have been sidetracked by accusations of certain kinds of bigotries, has been sidetracked by fallacious debate points. And today I think the Palestinian has run out of patience for this. So if you're inviting me or any other Palestinian on a TV screen and I have a minute and a half of screen time, I'm not going to waste my screen time explaining to you my humanity or defending myself. I'm going to come and speak about the injustices that I'm facing because I am not the defendant here. I am here to make a point.
Great. Thank you. Mohammed, you mentioned the audience. So do you think that if you have an Arabic audience or an English audience, that the discourse itself should differ based on who are you speaking to or even the language you speak about? You speak on?
I mean, there's two ways to answer this. Yani. For me, I would say like there's difference in little nuances. So for example, if I'm speaking to an audience in Atlanta, Georgia, for example, my focus would be about how Israeli police forces and American police forces train together in Atlanta, right? Like those are the differences. But no, I think the main dichotomy has always been in Arabic, you're assertive, you're militant, you're clear, and then in English, you're not that. In English, you make excuses, you try to justify, and then you proceed, you preface all of your talking points with, I don't believe in this, I believe in this. I don't believe these people should be thrown into the sea, I believe in this. I don't think we were invented in the 60s. You just do preface after preface after preface after preface, and then you're done. But I don't think I do this. I think I'm very good about not doing that.
Great. So, Hanaa, sports and politics should not mix. And like back in the Gulf, let's put it this way, as a young citizen of the Gulf area, like we've been talking about this idea of we have to separate sports from politics and they shouldn't be mixed. Like as an athlete, if you play against like someone from like the occupied land of Palestine, then you have to accept that because sport is separated from politics. So what do you think?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you all for having me here. It's such an honor to be alongside you both. And thank you, Nora, for the introduction. Thank you for this question. You know, I believe sports do not operate in a vacuum, and I'm sure a lot of you also can understand that as well. The way I see it, and in terms of my own experience, there's sort of two dynamics. The first is the politics of visibility, right? Me, as a Palestinian athlete, in and of itself is political. I remember, telling people I was representing the Palestinian Olympic team, and people were either surprised or shocked or even responded with comments such as, oh, you mean Israel? Palestine doesn't have a team. And so in here you see how simply representing a team is inherently political, and people say commonly the phrase, my existence is resistance. And the second key component is sort of zooming out and thinking about what we mean by politics. There's politics of belonging, there's politics of identity. And we saw that additionally this summer, even in light of my various teammates on the Olympic team. We all represented the different spatial realities of Palestinians in the 21st century. We had athletes from Bethlehem, from Gaza, from Canada, from Jerusalem as well. So coming together under the title of the Palestinian Olympic Team was really special, and it allowed us to move in ways that the occupation does not allow. And so in and of itself, that was a form of resistance. And we can talk more later about how to go about this and different examples throughout history, but I would say, this experience this past summer sort of illuminated the politics of visibility and the politics of belonging as well.
Great. Do you think that, since you're Palestinian, that you're morally obligated to support the cause just for the sake of you being a Palestinian?
It's an interesting question. Growing up in the diaspora, I think my experience, as I'm sure some of you in the audience, is different than those obviously growing up in the West Bank and Gaza, and even in Amman or other places in the Middle East. And so I never really actually had to ask myself that question, because I grew up seeking to go home, and going home meant, seeing relatives, seeing family, understanding their experience. And it was never a question of, I grew into understanding the politics of it, but it was always about supporting my family, supporting my friends, supporting what they're going through, and naming human rights abuses as they are. That's how I came to grow into it. And so it was never a question of, oh, should I not, or where do I sit on the spectrum? It was, of course, I'm going to stand with these people. There was never a doubt in my mind.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Hanaa. Mohammed, we went from this idea of the dichotomy of either an Islamic discourse supporting the قضية الفلسطينية or a pan-Arabist discourse in which we're talking about nationalism and stuff like that, to something else. Like youth now are talking about something different than the idea of Jamal Abdel Nasser or the idea of Ikhwan al-Muslimin or whoever like leading the Islamic discourse. So where are we heading, man?
Let me check my GPS. Yeah, I think it's always been a trap to think about the Palestinian cause as an Islamic cause or a religious cause in general, because pitting theologies against each other is not really the best or logical way of understanding historical conflicts or understanding where justice lies on a moral spectrum, right? You cannot interpret words that were written thousands of years ago and use them as historical fact or anthropological or archaeological evidence. You just cannot. And I think today we are looking at this in a way that is actually more accurate. We are looking at this as a colonial struggle in the sense that there was a people and then there was another people, and these people were sold the idea that they're going to be relocated in a country where no people exist. And in that relocation, there were many massacres. There were over 500 Palestinian villages destroyed. Almost 1 million Palestinians were forcibly dispossessed. And that catastrophe that happened in 1948 upon the establishment of the occupation state has not ended. And today we are seeing this dispossession happen in my neighborhood, Shulgarah, in the nearby neighborhoods of Silwan. We are seeing this happen in the desert as well, where Bedouin communities are displaced and relocated. So when you look at the material evidence on the ground, when you look at the things that are taking place on the ground, this is the only way you can rationalize this so-called conflict, is by looking at the power dynamics, is by looking at the geopolitics of it. This is one thing. The other thing is that when we remove the Islam, I'm not saying Palestinian Muslims face religious-based bigotry and religious-based oppression as a result of the occupation, of course, and so do Christians and so do Jewish people. That's not to negate that point, but when we use that as the larger framework, we fall into this trap that this is an ancient religious conflict, when really this is not that ancient of a conflict. It's barely 100 years old, and it must be and can be resolved.
So I'm going to take this idea of ancient conflict because if I'm not mistaken, I think Obama mentioned this once.
Yes.
So I'm going to go to Hanaa now. Hanaa, like if you reach a point in which you see a president of like the biggest, like the most powerful state in the world, he's seeing the conflict as an ancient conflict in a very like I think it's a maneuvering in a way. I'm not going to put it in a worse or more difficult way, but if you think about this like statement, it's an ancient conflict. How would you, as an athlete, like reply to this kind of statement? Is it like an ancient conflict? And in what sense that as an athlete you can respond and say, no, it's not like this. Like it's something else. If you like, you're not a journalist or like you're not an academic in a classroom in which you can find people in front of you. You're an athlete. How can you say, no, it's not an ancient conflict? Like how can you reply then?
Yeah, I think in the 21st century, we've seen a shift in terms of the narrative, as you mentioned, and it comes with social media and individuals who are famous for, be it modeling or cooking or athletics, all of a sudden having a platform to share their opinions on political injustices, on human rights abuses. And I think that's a central component of shifting the narrative. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I don't think that just because you're an athlete somehow you're not able of conveying your opinion on human rights abuses. And I think that's what made the youth movement that we saw this summer so effective is that it was people from different audiences. And I would add that I think athletics is unique in that the audience isn't necessarily expecting a political stance, so to speak. They're expecting a performance about, a time or a competition between two teams. And so there's a certain disruptive capacity when an athlete is able to take their platform or somebody else who's not traditionally in political spaces and make a statement about human rights abuses. And I would just, to answer your question, emphasize that, a comment on human rights abuses can come from anyone. It doesn't have to be an athlete, or you're not shortcoming for that.
So you believe that social media now are, in a way, like bringing people in sports field, from the sports field to somewhere else to talk and represent their point of views and stuff like that. But you do believe that this kind of transition, like every single person has a platform now, is a good idea. Like everyone can raise their voices and say everything, because we have another view of this as people may say, no, like people who's in the sports field should stay there, and people in the academic or in campuses should stay in their classroom. But people in the political sphere, they're the only people who can like raise voices and represent people because they are like democratically elected in a way. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think what has made this past summer and the revolution that we saw in digital media so effective in changing the narrative around Palestine is the fact that it's a decentralized movement. And that's what gives it its edge. There's not one specific group that's easy to target or easy to smear. It's people from all over the place having an opinion, educating audiences that maybe haven't even heard of Palestine. And so the first time they're hearing about it is in the context of human rights, which is an important shift. And obviously it's a double-edged sword. With everybody having a platform comes very serious surveillance, which Noura talked about in the beginning. And that's obviously something to be aware of. But I think there is an advantage in these transnational connections that we're seeing. You mentioned Atlanta and Ferguson, and being able to see the parallels between systems of oppression that use similar weapons against us both. And those connections happen through, Twitter in a lot of ways, and exposing the ways these systems are harming us all. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this answer. Mohammed, الكرد, I'm going to go back to where it came from, the Gulf again. When it comes to normalization, this idea in the Gulf recently is a big thing. Like it's not normalizing in the sports field or normalizing in the academic field. Now we're talking about like full normalization. We're talking about embassies opening and stuff like that, and even prime ministers visiting each other and stuff like that. So what do you think of what's happening recently when it comes to normalization?
Well, I'll say my very personal opinion. I think normalization is a betrayal to the Palestinian people, full stop. Thank you. But outside of this, outside of my own feelings as a Palestinian, what bothers me most about normalization is that it is marketed as this truce between the Abrahamic religions. It's marketed as this coexistence, kumbaya paradise that we have been missing in the Middle East, when really anybody with any critical thinking skills can look at this and understand, there is economic, political, geopolitical interests here at play, and these regimes are coming together. Thank you so much. These regimes are coming together, and when you look outside of the normalization, these regimes that are normalizing with the occupation, within their own right, independently of the occupation, are participating in certain oppressions against other countries, are doing things that are oppressive within their own right. So normalization and opposing normalization is not just for the sake of the Palestinians or for the justice of the Palestinians. It's that we should not be colluding or partnering or building power or building empire with oppressive states, because that means more people will only be oppressed. And I want to go back to this idea, marketing this as a truce between religions and this whole idea of an ancient conflict. It's all really just one part of a really good PR strategy that has relied so much on saying that this is complicated. This is a complicated, nuanced issue that not one can understand, when in reality, it's very asymmetrical, and it's very, 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 very clearly asymmetrical in reality. This whole idea that there's, Israel is in a bad neighborhood, and it's only ever defending itself, not only relies on Islamophobia, on racism that Palestinians and Muslim people, generally like Arabs are thought of as Muslim, that Arab people and Muslim people are aggressive, inherently dangerous, inherently terrorist. It doesn't only rely on this kind of Islamophobia, but it also relies on a really ancient colonial logic that says that the colonizer, the person, the perpetuator, the oppressor is always defending themselves. We see this with the Native Americans. We saw this in apartheid South Africa. And we see this across history. The only difference is that when we look at these things, when we look at slavery or other atrocities in history, we look at them with so much moral clarity today. And that moral clarity did not exist way back then, right? When we think about the Holocaust was legal under Nazi Germany, and there was controversy about it. There were people for the Holocaust. So this whole idea that today we have a general consensus, it only came after so many millions of people were victims to this injustice. So today I invite the world to think of ways to achieve this moral clarity that we tend to, as human beings, we tend to only come to after the damage has been caused. I am certain there will be museums erected in the honor of the Palestinian people. I am certain of this. I just hope these museums are established while the Palestinian people are still here.
I'm gonna ask this question in Arabic because I don't think my English is gonna help you with this question. You just said that هذه خيانة التطبيع
صحيح.
خيانة للفلسطينيين، ولكن في نهاية المطاف الأنظمة التي طبعت ستقول لمحمد الكرد هذا حق سيادي. ليست الدول هي دول سيادية sovereign state، يعني كل state عندها الحق في اتخاذ أي قرار. ما علاقة الدولة في أقصى الأرض في الشعب الفلسطيني غير مسألة أنهم يربطهم جد في السنة 8000. يعني ليش تعتبر هذا خيانة؟ في النهاية الوضع اليوم لا علاقة له بالاتفاق اللي حدث في الخمسينات والستينات. فلماذا هي خيانة؟
طبعا خيانة، لأنه مش خيانة لأخوك في الإسلام أو أخوك العربي، مش هيك قصدي بالخيانة. الخيانة إنه أنا مثلا إذا شفت شخص عماله بياكل أكله بالشارع وأنا فتت فيه أضرب كمان. This is a betrayal to the person getting beat up in the street, right? This is the whole idea. When you're silent in this oppression, or when you're doing economic ties and political diplomatic ties, you're actually aiding in that oppression. So that's how it's a khiyana. It's not, my opinion is not based on identitarian ties between us as Arabs. It's based on the actual systemic harm that these normalizations and these business deals, let's call them what they are, cause the Palestinian people as oppressed people, not as Muslim people, not as Arab people, just as oppressed people.
I mean, I tried my best, but really good, man. So, Hanaa, now, we're talking about Palestinian diaspora and how we can come together again, not only Palestinian, even Arab, all around the world. How can they come together and reach a point in which they can say we have a common or a shared cause that we should support together? How we can do this, how we can reach this point?
Yeah, it's a great question. As a Palestinian in the diaspora, identity is something I think that all of us struggle with a bit. And I think something that has helped me come to terms with this is understanding the logic of settler colonialism, right? And so being in the diaspora is a product of settler colonialism. My family was forced to flee. And the way that settler colonialism operates, obviously, is through fragmentation, isolation that allows them to acquire power. And part of this, in addition to spatial geographies, is also cultural geographies. And the loss of language, not being able to speak Arabic or not being fully versed in cultural norms, is also a product of Israel's settler colonialism. And I think what, we were talking about the media, and I think what some of these connections that we've been seeing in the past decade or so has been allowing us to sort of come to terms with this, name the separation for what it is, and create a space for Palestinians in the diaspora to exist within this movement and become more connected with their roots, vis-a-vis connection. So I think the Palestinian youth movement does a really great job of framing Palestine, as a condition. There are so many ways that Palestinians exist in this world, and there's not necessarily one form of Palestinianness. We were talking about shifting from identity politics to understanding us as people that are oppressed. And obviously oppression looks different depending on where you are. I'm not seeking to conflate everybody's experiences. But I think as a Palestinian in the diaspora, we need to understand our positionality. And there's a bit of responsibility to, be critical of these systems, how settler colonialism operates, and also be critical of the systems of your respective homes. Being from the United States, I have a responsibility to hold my local governments and national governments accountable because these systems work together. And so I think, athletics also offers a realm to allow for transnational exchange. And I've received wonderful messages during the Olympics and after from Palestinians throughout the diaspora asking how they can get in contact with Palestinians and create, a larger football team or create exchanges between athletes in Palestine and in Germany. And these connections, are so important to connecting us all. And with connections comes resistance.
With connection comes resistance. I like that. But this is going to be the last round of questions, so you guys have to be ready for your questions. It's a Q&A session, so be ready. So what is your message? Like, if you get to, bring all the people in the diaspora in one place and send them a message, what would you say?
It's a very tough question. I think, my answer probably will change in different points of my life. But I think something that I would want to convey, and I think is important, that we are all united in this struggle, and not to compress differences or speak over anybody's experiences, but I think it's important for Palestinians worldwide to understand they each have a responsibility, specifically those internationally, to hold their governments accountable, hold normalization, and understand the implications of that for their families in Palestine as well. That's probably something along the lines of what I'd say.
Thank you so much. So, الكرد, Mohammed, moving forward, what are we going to do next? Like we reach a point where we kind of stress this old framing and have a new or a potentially new framing. So what's next? What should we do now?
I'm very proud of last summer. I'm particularly proud of my community. I think they have done so much. And I'm not going to debunk or deny that there has been gains this past summer. However, so much of these gains have been symbolic, right? We are seeing the shift in narrative. We are seeing this new generation of youth radicalized. But yet there's no structural changes that are being imposed. So I think the decision makers, policy makers, people in positions of power, be it at Harvard, like Noura was talking about, be it at Time magazine that named me an influential something or whatever, or be it in government, need to be loyal to the wishes of their readers, to the wishes of their citizens, to the wishes of the street, and need to translate the shift in narrative into shift of policy. And I also want to take this moment to say that people in the diaspora, we are here, and I understand that we receive so much backlash. I can only imagine how Canary Mission has impacted everyone. For me, they have a really bad picture of me up there, and that's been horrible for me. For other people, they have lost their jobs, they have suffered really terrible consequences, lost scholarships, but this backlash still, in all of its entirety, in all of its heft, cannot compare to the backlash that Palestinians receive on the ground for simply living. And we must try to tap into our collective power as a people. This summer we've seen an unprecedented unification, unprecedented uprising. We saw Palestinians in Haifa, Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians in Jerusalem, Palestinians in Ramallah on the other side of the same gun. And we saw them utter the same sentences. It is our duty to collect and create and garner this political power, this collective power into political power, and also translate it structurally. This is the next step for us.
محمد الكرد and Hanaa, شكرا لكم جزيلا.
شكرا لك.
الآن أعتقد نطلب من الجمهور إذا كان عندهم أي سؤال يرفعون يدهم. سلمى تفضلي على طول.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Salma Al-Khoudi. I'm a PhD student at Stanford. It's so brilliant to see you, Mohammed. Mohammed, I followed you in Mana religiously this summer, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
My question is kind of stems from this Western dichotomy of politics. I think there's this increasingly globalized phenomenon here in the West where you're either a leftist or you're something else. And sometimes that can get a little murky, right? Like if you're for Palestine, you have to be for X, Y, Z, A, B, C, right? And that can sometimes turn people off in the same way that it can link struggles very intimately, and we saw that with Black Lives Matter. My question to you is, how do we stay true to the Palestinian cause as a distinct cause that's also, part of this system of global injustices and systematic tensions, but at the same time, how do we pick our allyships closely while staying true to our greater, goal of uplifting human rights everywhere?
Thank you. What was your name again?
Salma.
Thank you, Salma. I think, first of all, we must identify the pillars of the Palestinian cause. For me, and forgive me, I forget one of them, but for me, this is a human rights issue, this is a land issue, this is a refugee issue, and a freedom of movement issue. These are really the main pillars of the Palestinian cause. And I think we have articulated it for many years, and it's not that hard to get lost in the sauce. But it's also not that hard to stay true to the definition we have articulated, and the definitions that have been, or the action items that have been articulated for us by the BDS movement or other movements that's come before us. I also think it's contrary. I think the benefits of linking struggles and building allyship outweigh the negatives, and we must just be sensitive to how we link these struggles, and we also must participate in the other struggles. I think Palestinians, we think we're the center of the universe, and we want everyone to come to our SJP meeting, but we don't go to other people's indigenous meetings or Black Lives Matter meetings. I'm sorry if that is a hasty generalization. But I think we also must be vigilant in also participating in other struggles and building allyship, because it's integral, and it's also it's good to imagine the world beyond states, right? It's good to imagine the world beyond borders, and imagine the Palestinian cause just limited to the Palestinian people in the identitarian sense. We are in this because we have lost land, we have people who are refugees, we have people who are in open air prisons, we have people who are fragmented across legal statuses and across fabricated geographies. These are things that link us together with other people who have been victims of similar acts of oppression around the world. I think there's more power in that than there is harm.
شكرا لك يا أحمد. سؤال آخر تفضل.
I'm from Kuwait. I have a question for Hanaa. In Kuwait, we grew up with the Palestinian cause and learned about it in middle school and high school. And Kuwaiti athletes always refuse facing Israeli athletes and withdraw from participating as a form of resistance and sending a message. Do you feel like these acts help the Palestinian cause whatsoever?
Thank you, first of all, for your question. Remind me your name.
Abdulaziz.
Thank you for your question. When you think about the Olympics, Tokyo 2020, we saw two athletes, two judoka players from Algeria and Sudan, both forfeit their competition against Israel. And this is a practice we've seen since the early 2000s, from Iran's men's volleyball team to even chess players. And it's an utmost act of solidarity. And I think what, in those cases, it shows to me as an athlete is that obviously Palestine is so much bigger than the individual, and it represents the sort of interconnectedness of oppression around the globe. And I think in framing it as such, it's important to take a step back and think about holding our institutions accountable in this light. So the IOC, for instance, in 1964, actually in Tokyo, they banned South Africa from competing in the Olympics due to apartheid. And it's important to understand and hold these institutions to the same institutions to the same bar in the case of Israel as well. And, it's always appreciated as a Palestinian athlete, it brings a smile to my face to understand that the Solidarity are willing to forfeit their competition, and at the same time, we need to see FIFA and the IOC holding the same bar and understanding that, settler colonial state is not welcome in a place that is supposed to be upholding values of excellence, respect, and friendship, which are the three pillars of the Olympics.
Great, thank you.
My name is Saad. I'm from University of Illinois, but I'm Palestinian too. So my question was just, so I know that you're an accomplished person even outside of like this summer. You have albums like Belly Dancing on Wounds, for example, and you and your sister have always been quite outspoken. In terms of this summer, do you wish to be seen outside of the lens of Sheikh Jarrah, or do you lean into it?
Thanks, Saad. That's a very interesting question. I do wish to be seen outside of it because I've always just existed outside of it. But also, I want to take a minute to say, this is not directly answering your question, but this summer I've always enjoyed a certain kind of visibility as a writer, and this summer, like this visibility kind of skyrocketed as an activist. And although it has its positive merits, it's pretty important to always remember that this summer was a real event, and people had to pay really, really high prices for it, and it just happened that my sister and I have this visibility, whereas there's thousands and thousands of people who participated in this uprising who are today in prison, or today who have lost their jobs or have lost a loved one, and so on and so forth. So I hesitate, and I'm very uncomfortable actually by the limelight being as a direct result of activism. And this is why, like, when I go to speak at universities and people want to like take a picture with me, I say no, because like this kind of celebrity or celebritization or like graphing of an icon it's very uncomfortable for many reasons. But the main reason, in my opinion, is that it kind of reconciles you with the mainstream, right? You have suffered state violence, and now we are offering you this status as like an influential person, or like man of the year, or blah, blah, blah. And that not only creates resentment among the people who have helped you and created you and raised you, but it also reduces the struggle of thousands and thousands of people who work tirelessly to your own face, and I don't think that's fair. I hope that answers the question.
أنا شيماء حليم من جامعة جوري. أنا مغربية. سأقدم سؤالي باللغة العربية الفصحى. سؤالي إلى سيد محمد الكرد. نعلم أن قضية شيخ جراح بالقدس انشهرت وتعرفت أكثر في السوشيال ميديا، بفضل السوشيال ميديا وبفضل الإعلام. لكن سؤالي هنا، يعني بعد أشهر من انتشار القضية، قضية شيخ جراح على السوشيال ميديا، هل كان لها تأثير سلبي على عائلة الكرد وعلى العائلات الفلسطينية في الشيخ جراح أو لا؟ إحنا شفنا إنه كانت لها تأثير إيجابي كبير، إنه القضية اشتهرت في العالم العربي، وبفضل السوشيال ميديا كان أنا في المغرب عرفت بقضية شيخ جراح، والناس من كل الدول العالم عرفت قضية شيخ جراح. بس ما وراء الكواليس شنو صار؟ هل تم هل الموضوع أثر عليكم بطريقة سلبية على عائلتكم وعلى العائلات الموجودة في الشيخ جراح؟ وشكرا.
شكرا لك. Basically the question was about whether the Sheikh Jarrah has exploded in the media, on social media. Has that helped us really materially? I'll first start by saying that it exploded in spite of social media, not because of social media, because there is so much restriction against Palestinians. I know this firsthand. I just read this in a whistleblower report that came out from Facebook talking about my account being demoted. I know this because the Palestinian content in general is codified and silenced and so on and so forth. Now for me, I would say the prices of last summer have been high. Right? To answer this as a yes or no question, no, there hasn't been. Yes, the movement has cemented us in our homes temporarily. Had there not been a global movement, then we would have already been on the street. Does this mean we're not going to end up on the street? No one knows, right? And there comes a financial burden with this. There comes a huge psychological burden for this, for my mother. I always think about how my mother handles being on the receiving end of tear gas and sound bombs every single day for the past 3 months. how's that going to impact her? How's that going to impact my neighbors, right? So there are high prices. But to me, at the end of the day, this is not about my house. And it's way larger than my house. The accomplishments of this movement cannot be measured by whether or not I retain my house. The fact that we have defeated a state with a Ministry of Strategic Affairs in shaping a global narrative is a huge feat for me. And that, I don't know if it outweighs all of the high prices that we had to pay this summer, but I definitely think that it's not an easy question to navigate it, and it cannot be disregarded. This is really about recentering the Palestinian cause in the global stage, and it's about recentering something that has been marketed and propagandized as a real estate dispute for what it really is, forced ethnic displacement.
هنالك شخص أنا وعدت أعطيه الكلمة وبعدين نبدأ.
I really appreciate it. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. My name is Amr Ghali. I'm an oncology researcher at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. I had a question for Mohammed al-Kurd. As a fellow twin, I have a twin sister. I was wondering, because people ask me all the time, who's older between the two of you?
She is 10 minutes older than me.
See, mine is 5 minutes older. She never puts it past me. But actually, I had an actual question. Just in terms of, and this can either be directed to either speaker, whoever would like to respond to it, just to say, between the methods employed in grassroots activism and an ideal end goal, that is, where would you like to see all of the raising of awareness? Where would you like to see all of the media action, all of the efforts on social media occurring around the country in terms of realizing a new fact on the ground? That is, you indicated you would like to translate the will of the people in terms of public policy. Could you comment a little bit more about how you think the Palestinian movement can eventually reach that state? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a great question. Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael, who's a black power thinker and a part of the was part of the Black Panther Party, speaks a lot about the difference between mobilization and organizing. And I think what we saw last summer was mobilization. There was a crisis, there was urgency, there was 500 people about to lose their homes, and so people across the world mobilized and took onto the streets and protested, right? Now the challenge is to transform that mobilization into organizing, right? We have to stop acting out on urgency, to stop acting out on momentum, and rather act out on the variables that exist on the ground. The fact that there is a military occupation that is actively displacing people. If it's not in Sheikh Jarrah, it's in Silwan. If not in Silwan, it's in Masafir Yatta. And we need to be building structures that can combat this all days of the year, not just when it's super eminent. And of course, that's not to say that it's not super eminent. It's always super eminent. But you're not always going to have a neighborhood with like a good media strategy and people ready to speak to the media 24/7 as we were. And I think now the challenge really is to transform this mobilization into real organizing, to translate this, one, in collective power for us in the diaspora, for us here in the United States, to have political power and push in all of the institutions that create the policies. I could start with the deadly exchanges between police officers. I could go to the military aid that the United States gives to Israel every year. There's a myriad of ways to tackle this. But really, we need to organize beyond the rage, beyond the urgency, beyond the panic. We need to organize just to have for the mere goal of having political power. I don't know if you want to add something.
I would just add that thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement specifically in the United States and the discourse that came out of that, thinking about virtue signaling and slacktivism and a lot of institutions and individuals that speak out in support but don't follow through with action. And so thinking about how to transfer from the disruption of the narrative to institutional capacity. And there are, existing ways, thinking even about athletics in the case of South Africa, boycotting in that specific context works. And it's not, going to work in every context, and it's not perfect, but it is important to have a collective movement and collective tactic where Palestinians, both in Palestine and in the diaspora, are connected in that regard.
هل بتشوف إنه دور الفلسطيني الداخل هو فعليا أكبر من دور الفلسطينيين بالخارج؟ لأنه فعليا إحنا لما ننزل حتى إجازة على فلسطين إحنا مهما عانينا يعني بنلاقي إنه فلسطينيين الداخل هم اللي أكثر عايشين بفعليا معاناة ممكن حتى اعتادوا عليها فعليا. فمهما إحنا ضلينا متمسكين في قضيتنا وفعلا إحنا ربينا عليها، مرات بنسأل هل بنقدر إنه إحنا نرجع فعليا؟ هل بنقدر إحنا نكون جزء أساسي من فعليا من تحرير فلسطين؟ فهل بتشوف فعلا إنه ممكن يكون التغيير الحقيقي من الفلسطيني الداخل، خصوصا إنه في الآونة الأخيرة بنشوف إنه أثر أي حدا بالداخل لما يثبت قد فعلا الحياة كتير صعبة، رغم إنه اعتدنا عليها إلى إنها حياة مو طبيعية في ضمن الاحتلال. هل بتشوف فعلا إنه ممكن يكون التحرير من الداخل بهاي الطريقة؟ شكرا.
Thank you. I don't see a hierarchy. I don't see like this has way more weight. I mean, if I'm going to be honest with you, I do think people outside of Palestine have way more power than the people inside of Palestine, right? You speaking out is definitely or most likely not going to land you in prison the same way I'm speaking out is mostly going to be landing me in prison. So I actually disagree with the point. I do think people outside of here have more power. But beyond this, beyond the hierarchies of it, I think we on the inside, people on the ground on the inside have a role to play, and people here have a role to play. And how do you navigate that role is by organizing locally, by placing a local lens on how you decide and figure out your role. There are many fronts to be fighting on. If you are on the Hill in Washington, D.C., there's a certain role for you to play. If you're in Chicago, there's a certain role for you to play. So really interrogating the role locally, and also extending that role beyond the politics of identity, beyond the politics of symbolic solidarity, and really into like grassroots work. That is how you make change. It's not just about like holding on to our identities as Palestinians. And I say this because when you say the Palestinians of the outside, who are the Palestinians of the outside? They are refugees. They are the pillar of the Palestinian cause. Some of them are lucky, and they're here in the United States. I'm not saying that they don't face discrimination. Of course they face discrimination, particularly Islamophobia. But Palestinians in refugee camps like in Lebanon, in Syria, now Syrians, also Syrian refugees as well. I don't even think there's a way for me to say this. But Palestinians in refugee camps, they have been fragmented in similar ways that we have been fragmented on the inside, and they have been defanged even more than we have been. And I think really finding and finalizing this kind of power that we wield on the outside that doesn't have the same repercussions that we would face on the inside is really imperative. And actually, this is, I think, the one missing link in all of our struggle today is the role that the diaspora plays. Why aren't we outside of embassies every other week? Why aren't we lobbying? Why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we creating media content here, targeting the people that are making decisions here, the people that are shaping the narrative here, right?
حسام ومن ثم صاحب حسام.
My name is Hussam, and my question to both of you is about hope. And I think, Mohammed, as you mentioned, despite everything that happened this past summer, the only wins that we really saw were symbolic wins, right? And even after the ceasefire happened, we saw this global movement kind of die down, even if situations on the ground weren't really improved. And after that, we saw the U.S. approve billions of funding for Israel again, even if only 7 members opposed or things like that. And I had the privilege of working with Noura on the PSC, and as she talked about in the very beginning, this kind of burnout can be very emotionally taxing. Even for me, someone as an Egyptian, I have the privilege of not really paying that much attention, but it still really affect me when you see that even after all this effort you put on, even when you feel like you've made some kind of improvement, you see things like normalization, like funding, like things like that just feels like we're taking 1 step forward and 10 steps back. So my question to you, when it feels like we're so far away from the ultimate dream of having a free Palestine from the river to the sea, how can you maintain hope?
Great question. Hannah, do you want to answer it? Should I answer? Yeah, I think first of all, for me, hope is an obligation, right? It's not something I decide to be. It's I have to be hopeful in order to continue. And that's how we can answer about hope. But I think it's also really important for us to frame this normalization, the Iron Dome funding, all of these things, not as separate from the past summer's accomplishment, but really in response to the past summer's accomplishments. We have seen time and time again that if you're going to resist colonial violence, you're only going to be met with more and more colonial violence. They are effectively trying to teach us a lesson. Late May, after all of the protests were going down, Israeli police was boasting about settling the score. And they went around Palestinian towns all over Palestine and collected thousands of Palestinians and accused them of trumped-up terrorism charges. Obviously, most of them had their charges dropped against them because they were bogus. But they wanted to teach us a lesson. They wanted to tell us that if you're going to do this, if you're going to resist us, then you're going to suffer. You're going to lose your freedom. You're going to lose your home. I know. I'm actually writing an article about this for The Nation. I talked to many lawyers that worked in Palestine the past few months, and I heard about Palestinian minors who had been arrested, and as part of the interrogation were told that their parents had died. And if you want to go to your parents' funeral, you have to confess, or were shown pictures of demolished homes, like, computer adjusted, Photoshop pictures of demolished homes, and said, this is what happened to your home because you threw stones. And this whole defanging of the movement is by design. But it backfired, right? I'm not at all trying to undermine the prices people have to pay and have paid, but it also backfired. Because for the first time, especially in Palestine 1948, you are seeing Palestinians facing the same batons that we were bruised by in Jerusalem. And yes, that's hard, and yes, that hurts, and it bruises, but it also reasserts a certain message that we are all Palestinians, despite the fragmentation. And that also is what gives us hope, is that even when we win, we generate wins, and even when they repress us and violate us and impose violence on us, there are wins to be generated that come out of that oppression as well.
Hanaa, maintaining hope.
I would echo your statements. I think it's so important. There's really no alternative, otherwise you'll drive yourself crazy. And I think we each find moments that stick, that remind you of, the light at the end. And, for me, that's interpersonal connection, thinking about, the messages I've received, the relationships that I've made along the way with teammates, with friends, with passerbyers, that, remind us that there is humanity in this world, and people will surprise you. And I do believe, as you mentioned, Palestinian Museum, that day will come, and I think you have to visualize it to know what you're working toward.
آخر سؤال لدينا هنا.
Hi, I'm Yusuf. I'm from Gaza. I came 4 months ago to Stanford University. I've been asked a lot about the Palestinian cause and situation. And at the end of every discussion, that's a great timing. At the end of every discussion, always pops the question of, what do you think is the solution? Or in other words, do you think Palestinians and Israelis could live together? What would you answer this? My question is for both of you.
Go ahead.
By all means.
I think it's an irrelevant question. I think there's, I think you asked it very nicely, but most of the time people are like, do you want to throw settlers into the sea? That's really the question we get asked. Let's be, I'm not one to mince words here. Usually it's like, are you going to kill all the settlers? Are you going to do this and this? And that, everybody, is a fallacy of debate, right? It's a slippery slope. We have this idea that if Palestine is liberated or if Palestinians are afforded equal or basic human rights, then somehow an ethnic cleansing is going to be enacted against another people. Not only does this draw from the very foundational, the very foundational identity of the State of Israel that was founded on ethnic cleansing, but it's also hypothetical violence. It's literally irrelevant violence. Today there are Palestinians, millions of them, in an open-air prison, Palestinians who are denied freedom of movement, Palestinians who are shot in the street without trial, Palestinians who are held indefinitely in prisons. without charge or trial. We have Palestinian losing their homes demolished. We have a myriad of material violence against Palestinians. And yet when you try to enlighten somebody about the Palestinian cause, they ask you about what happens to the settlers. That is a red herring. That is to distract from the point. To that I say, what happens to the 6 million Palestinian refugees that are decaying away in refugee camps? That's really the question.
شكرا لكم يعني أنا استمتعت شكرا لكم فعلا يعني الله يعطيكم العافية